I want to say two things about atheism, a way in which it's good and a way in which it's bad. Atheist is a word like queer or Tory. It's a word that originally is an insult. It's a derogatory word. And like queer and Tory, at different points in history, it's been reclaimed and used by people who want to protest against, usually, Christianity. At the same time, it's also a word that refers to a lack of belief in gods. And I think that's the way in which it is useful, but I'll come back to that. I think the way in which it's not very useful is if you try and start using it to mean more than just a lack of belief in gods. And because of the way in which atheism has been used as a word like queer or Tory within very religious cultures, as a reaction to those religious cultures, I think it's tended to acquire, people who've used that word about themselves have tended to acquire in their own use of that word a lot of other baggage around it. So people will use the word atheist, for example, to mean people who are rational and believe in science. People will use the word atheist to mean people who have a very human-centred view of morality. These are all good things, by the way, but I think that they're better captured by the use of other words, like, for example, humanist. People use the word atheist to describe sometimes someone who has not only a rational view and a human-centred moral compass, but also someone who has sort of a liberal view about society as a whole. And I think that's problematic. I think it's problematic to put so much a burden on one word, which really at its root doesn't mean anything of the sort. And I think it's problematic because it doesn't describe reality. There are plenty of atheists who believe in, angels, for example. You can see that from opinion polls and surveys. There are plenty of atheists who believe in your crystal healing and ghosts and all sorts of other very non-rational things. There are plenty of atheists who have very non-liberal social views as well. So that's, I think, a way in which some contemporary uses of the word atheism are unhelpful. The way then in which I think it's very good is that I think in cultures that do have a lot of inherited religion, like I think in Europe, where we have an awful lot of harmful inheritance from religion, built into our society, a lot of inequality, a lot of privilege, a lot of discrimination, a lot of very negative views of human beings, of sex, of our own bodies, a lot of negative views about reward and punishment and life after death, which sort of infected our psychologies in very damaging ways. I think it is useful to have a word that very explicitly defines itself against all that. So although in an ideal world, I think you wouldn't have to say atheist because you wouldn't need to define yourself against a belief that, to me at least, is self-evidently absurd, I think that it is one use of it to react against all those things and be a sort of rallying point against those things is still legitimate. So there's a bad side to it and there's a good side to it, and I'll leave it there.
I don't know if many people here saw the Atheist bus a few years ago. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Toured around London for a while. I was just brought back to remembering this by reading a new book by Francis Spufford called Unapologetic: Why Despite Everything Christianity Can Still Make Surprising Emotional Sense. And he asked the interesting question, looking at that slogan, what is the most objectionable word in that slogan? There was a bit of controversy in the humanist world about what's with the probably. Spufford's main objection was to the enjoy. Stop worrying and enjoy your life. And you could see his point, really. It's like the rather unctuous waiter in a posh restaurant that puts the parmesan and then says, enjoy, in that sort of have a nice day, corporate hospitality kind of way. But the point that Spufford made about it was that the underlying implication of this statement is that enjoyment is some sort of natural state of affairs that's only being disturbed by people being worried by preachers and believers. A point of view he briskly dismisses as complete bollocks. And what's interesting, and you can see that, as he said, enjoys fine, but enjoy doesn't really connect with the whole vast range of problems of human experience. And what does that statement seems to be pitched at some sort of notion of an idealized consumer. What would it mean to somebody experiencing loss, bereavement, illness, death, all the vicissitudes of life? It leaves people with no sense of any hope or consolation. But the Atheist Bus was a great success. Started with a Guardian blog, and just simply a reaction to religious propaganda that upset somebody. Launched the blog, put the thing out, raised £140,000 in a fortnight, and went global then. There's Atheist buses now, you can see them on the web in every country in the world, lots of celebrity endorsements. But here's the question that interests me about this, is, the guy with the sandwich board saying, "Repent, the end is nigh," has been around all our lives. That religious sort of propaganda, that sort of statement. Why suddenly, at this stage in history, has this become the big focus of a major campaign among the thoughtful sections of society? The other thing is, why now is one question. The other thing is, why is the campaign against it have such a shouty character? It's obviously part and parcel of the whole wave of the new so-called new atheism, the Four Horsemen, Hitchens and Dennett and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, who wrote books then in the same moment as this, all casting heaps of scorn and derision on anybody who had any religious faith. And I think to step back for to say, what's behind all this? What's driving this forward? To look to the whole moment of the last 10, 15 years. And I think the one way it's very well encapsulated by the historian Eric Hobsbawm, who died at the age of 95 a couple of weeks ago. And in his last rather gloomy reflections on the whole experience of the 20th century, he commented on the apparent failure of all programs, old and new, for managing or improving the affairs of the human race. That's a very gloomy outlook. He looked at the exhaustion of communism, of socialism, of social democracy and liberalism, looked at the way in which the key values of humanism and the Enlightenment had come widely into question as a result of the whole experiences of the end of the 20th century. And it seemed that we'd reached a state, after 200 years of history in which human beings had thought that they could intervene to make the world a better place, we'd reached a notion of some controversy whether history had reached a complete end, but certainly historical change was now taking place without any subject guiding it. We'd reached the idea of change taking place without any agent, change just objectified. And the humanist notion of some sort of autonomous agent is replaced by the notion of a fragile subject, somebody to whom things happen, rather than somebody who makes things happen. A very significant reversal in the whole outlook of humanity compared with the previous years. It's quite interesting to look at the Atheist Bus. If you looked on the website, the interesting point that it made was, by way of justifying the slogan, was to say, religious advertising works particularly well on those who are vulnerable, frightening them into believing with threats of eternal damnation. And you see this campaign begins off from this sense of loss of subjectivity and focuses on that notion of human vulnerability and the sort of idea of frightened, fragile, pathetic sort of person. Find out more about atheism as a positive and liberating alternative to religion. And, of course, atheism can't be a positive alternative to religion because it's simply a rejection of God. It's a negative. Can't be a liberating alternative worldview. And indeed, it never was for the great humanists of the 19th century, for Marx or for Darwin. It was always something entirely secondary to their wider sense of their both intellectual and political project. For Marx, free conscious activity is man's species character. That's the key thing. Human experience is the foundation of knowledge, and the whole concept of the human subject is one who engages in the world, develops an understanding of the world, develops a way of changing the world in order to change and transform humanity itself. It's about that dialectic of subject and object through which society is humanized and humanity progresses. That's what's been lost over the recent decades, and that's what this moment is a reaction to. The irony of the anti-religious focus is that the origins of the contemporary counter-enlightenment are not to be found in religion, but in the ideas of secular humanism itself, particularly in the ideas of science that are very popular in that world, particularly in the notions of evolutionary science that particularly is associated with Dawkins and some of the others in that tradition. Not science, but scientism, where science is extended from its legitimate area to a whole claims of a wider scope in society. Some ideas which were very influential in the discussion today. I've now got my red card, so unfortunately I can't really continue to develop these themes in the time I've got available. But that's the key problem I think we've got behind this, is that the downgrading of subjectivity that underlies the whole historical moment is reinforced by the scientism that underlies the world of new atheism, and it's led to a whole problem where subjectivity, which is the key to resolving the crisis of humanity, has become what is downgraded, not only by the movement of history, but by this response to the problems of religion.
Hi, good evening. My name's Alom Shaha, and I'm an atheist. And maybe to lots of you in this room that's not a big deal, but for someone from my background, I was born in Bangladesh, I'm an immigrant, grew up in a Muslim family, it should have been a big deal. It wasn't a particularly big deal for me because both my parents are dead, and there's no one to be ashamed of me or who's going to make me feel guilty about openly talking about being a Muslim. However, being an atheist, sorry. However, there are... Let it slip. However, unfortunately, I know lots of people who wouldn't be able to sit here and just say the simple sentence that I am an atheist, because they feel unable to do so. And Andrew talked about the word queer, and there are other parallels with the gay community. You know, I'm really glad I live in London in the 21st century, where one can be openly gay, where, you know, gay people can walk down the street holding hands, kissing, whatever. It's totally acceptable. And yet London in the 21st century is a place where lots of people would not feel comfortable being openly atheist. Think about that. Michael just said that atheism was about the rejection of God, just about the rejection of religion. I don't think that's the case. I think that for a lot of people, accepting that they are atheists is accepting a fundamental truth about who they are. I think atheism for me is about how I see the world, and I think how one sees the world is central to one's identity. And so just as gay people may have felt not able to be honest about being gay in the past, we live amongst people who are not able to be honest about the fact that they don't believe in God. So I think those people are oppressed. I think those people are not free to be who they want to be. And maybe it's not quite the same as being gay, but I do think there are interesting parallels. I think that lots of people feel compelled to pretend to believe. And we have what Daniel Dennett calls belief in belief, where people go along with this kind of idea that belief in God is a good thing, so I'll just pretend and go along with it, and I won't come out as an atheist because that'll rock the boat of the community I live in or whatever. And I think this is really damaging to society, because what it does is it lends power to religious institutions which are based on anachronistic ideas. You know, for example, you know, the whole thing about gay marriage and so forth. You know, these ideas which people cling on to, which lead them to moral judgments, are based on texts that are so ancient as to be meaningless, really. And I think we only win those battles by having more people come out and be honest. I think at the heart of, for me, the reason why I want to promote atheism, rather than to be anti-religion, I think that it's a really important point I want to make, is my position is pro-atheism rather than anti-religious. And I think that's a subtle but very important distinction to make. I think, for me, my work is about encouraging more people to just be honest about what they really think about these matters, because I think an awful lot of people, in my experience, are fundamentally dishonest about how they view the world in this context. And I think if more people were just able to come forward without worrying about what other people would think of them and just say, look, I don't think this thing called God exists, I don't think these texts are really relevant to how I live my life, I think we would live in a better world. I really do believe that. So I think atheism is important for that reason. Some people have responded very positively to my book, I'm really glad to say. Unfortunately, I'm not one of the four horsemen of the new atheism or whatever, but I'm going to ride my little Shetland pony and follow along behind them. I don't agree with a lot of the religion bashing that goes on. I totally understand why for some people a religious view on the world is the one that suits them best. I think we all arrive at different ways of looking at the world and making sense of it, ultimately. I think as individuals, we all come at a view of the world and need to find ways to deal with it. And I don't have a problem with those people who find comfort and solace in this idea of a God. However, what I do have a problem with is societies which don't allow other people who have a different view, a different take on the world, to live freely. And unfortunately, there are still communities in this country where people do not feel free to be who they really are. I'm going to stop there.
I think that the point of atheism that makes most sense to me, actually, is atheism keeps theists on their toes. And I wanted to try and say something about that in 5 minutes by just running through very quickly the three biggest hitters in the atheist world, you might say, from the 19th and 20th century. That's no less figures than Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. And I think each of them had a very important criticism of religion that ultimately was wrong, but nonetheless is very useful for religious people to hear and engage with. So take Marx to start with. His idea about religion and why religion exists is summed up in this phrase, "It was the opiate of the people." And broadly he thought that it would be wrong to campaign against religion, but that religion would disappear as people's material well-being increased. It would just sort of cease to be important to them, to matter to them, as our material well-being increased. Now, that clearly hasn't happened. He was definitely wrong about that. But I think what he was right to point out was that in the sort of early mid-capitalist period in which he wrote, religion, as it were, was losing sight of the issues of social justice. And because of Marx, religion, particularly Christianity, I guess I'm thinking of, it's the religion that I know, has gained a very keen sense of social justice, that heaven is a place on earth, to quote Linda Carlisle, I believe, as well as perhaps somewhere else too. So that's a very important thing for religious people to hear from Marx, that social justice matters. Freud had a different idea about religion, which is equally interesting. He believed that religion is an illusion and wrote this book, The Future of Illusion. But he meant illusion in a very particular sense. He thought that all human beings actually form their connection with the world, gain their sense of what it is to be alive by, as it were, projecting illusions out into the world. And then those illusions are met with reality. And some of them are proven to be wrong, but some of them are proven to be right through this reality testing. And the illusion, as it were, brings reality to life. It makes life worth living, he thought. Now, Freud, of course, thought that religion was one illusion that was wrong and that gradually would just be sort of proven to be wrong. It would be an illusion that didn't work. Whereas the illusion that there isn't a God would be gradually proven to be right. It would chime more fully with reality, you might say. Now, again, I think that he's been shown to be wrong about that. Most people don't think that religion is an illusion that is wrong. But what he does tell religious people, in a way, is to reality check, to grow up, you might say, to become mature in their religious beliefs, to develop them, to deepen them, to question them. And that's always been an important element within religious traditions, but perhaps it needed saying again in the 20th century. And so I think Freud, as the atheist, says to religious people, do some reality testing, question, grow up, to use another colloquial phrase. For Nietzsche, to move on to the third really big shot atheist, Nietzsche's theory of religion was that God is dead because the cultural and social baggage, if you like, that's required for God to live has ceased, or at least he thought it was ceasing. He actually, I think, says that it will take 2 or 3 centuries to really unravel when he announces God is dead in the book The Gay Science. And instead, he wanted to bring about a will to power, a kind of overcoming the human all too human by the power of our own capacities, if you like. Now, what to make of this? Well, if you read Nietzsche, you'll know that there are 2 people that he hates more than any others. One is Jesus and one is Socrates. And the reason why he hates Jesus and Socrates is because he thought that they had the will to power to change civilization. So both Socrates and Jesus are seminal figures in the history of ideas. Like no one else in the West, they, as it were, brought about a change in civilization. But I think what Nietzsche didn't understand was that both Jesus and Socrates, at least themselves, didn't think they were doing this by their own will to power. They thought they were doing it because they were serving God or a god. So Socrates believed that he was on a mission from Apollo, And Jesus, of course, thought that he was on a mission from the Judeo-Christian God. And so what I think that Nietzsche's prompt says to believers is don't rely on your own strength. The sort of biblical phrase would be to rely on God's strength. But perhaps more broadly we could say that human beings are the creatures for whom their own existence is too small for them. They need to reach to wider horizons. And I think that Nietzsche's desire, as it were, to try and operate within the sphere of the human alone through this will to power has shown to fail. And in fact, in his own hatred of Jesus and Socrates, perhaps he sort of secretly knew that already. So the three big atheist figures, I think, say to theists, keep on your toes, because social justice matters, because you need a mature spirituality, not an infantile one, and because we need to serve a broader horizon than our own will to power, our own selfish concerns.
Okay, thanks everyone. And before I come to the audience, I just want to put a couple of questions. First of all, to Andrew and Alum as the atheist, so to speak, or I suppose he gets the atheist. But obviously, one point you make is that we don't all live in the same society in a sense.
Yep.
For some people who have different cultural background, different families and so on, that's obviously very different. That's actually a question that I'll put to Mike as well. But in response to what Andrew was saying about it's dangerous to make atheism mean more than disbelief, and you seem to be suggesting actually it does mean more. And one example, you mentioned gay marriage. The supposition then would be that if not for religion, gay marriage would have been established long ago. I mean, do you think that's the case? Do you think?
I think that is absolutely the case. Yeah, but my main point is this: look, when one decides one is an atheist, one has come to a conclusion about how one sees the world. And I think how one sees the world is fundamental to our sense of identity and who we are. And not being allowed to be who you really are is an oppression of one's human rights. So if you wake up and realise you're gay, and then live in a society where you're not allowed to be gay, or people look down on gay people, you live a second-class life. And gay people used to, and unfortunately in some cases still do, live a second-class life. And my point is that atheism is a personal position about how we view the world, which is so central to how we live and how we go about our everyday life, that we should be allowed to be atheists. And we're not all allowed to be atheists.
Okay, Andrew, I mean, do you think that Alam's position is different from what you said about?
No, I don't think so, because I think that if you ask the question atheism, what's the point, then one of my answers would be the same as Alam's, which is that on the one hand, of course, it is a word that you don't want to overuse and put too much weight onto. You don't want to try and pile on a load of other, like I was saying, atheism is rationalism, is morality, is evidence, all those things onto it. But one of the very clear answers to the question atheism, what's the point, is the one that Alam has indicated through his personal experience, which is that it is a very good reaction. There is a point to atheism as a reaction, okay, and I think that's one of the points to atheism. It's not, atheism is far more pointless to me, having grown up as the child of non-religious parents and grandparents, than it is to Alam, having come from a Muslim background. So I think that what I wanted to say is that on the one hand, there obviously is a very strong point to atheism if it's experienced by someone as a sort of emancipation or a realization or whatever. But for other people, it is just a word that describes a position on a question which to them might be actually a completely irrelevant question, like it is to me. I don't find the idea of God or the issue of God or whether God exists remotely interesting. It's something that's completely outside of my interest. And I think, and my views about morality and how I should behave to other people and how the sort of society that we should try and build, and my views about meaning in life are not based primarily on an acknowledgement that this is a godless universe, right? You can build values, meaning on that, and maybe as a reaction to a religious upbringing, but that's not the weight that I would give to my atheism. It's the same, this is something that these four horsemen often say. It's this, you might as well say you're a fairist or a unicornist and so on. It's that irrelevant to sort of at least my own life.
Why is it there is no a unicornist movement? There's a specific historical moment, perhaps. And so, Mark, you were talking about Nietzsche said maybe it would take a couple of 100 years. Marx has been proved wrong because although we are richer, religion still holds. But we're not, it's not, we don't live under communism. So for Marx, wasn't there a suggestion that there was something more than that society might achieve? And Mike has made the point that the new atheist moment comes at a time when big projects for improvement in society, forward-thinking political movements don't seem to be particularly prominent. So do you think maybe it's premature to say that Marx's thesis is wrong?
Well, capitalism might collapse, but he might be right about that. But whether or not communism will come about, there seems to have been a fairly considered effort to try and make that happen, and it didn't work out.
But specifically on the atheism question, if history progressed to an extent whereby people felt no need of God.
Yeah, well, again, I think the 20th century was 100 years trying to make atheism stick in various parts of the world, and it just hasn't worked.
It has.
The minute communism has collapsed, certainly in Russia, but now we're seeing it shifting. So effectively, the atheist doctrine, the atheist dogma in China is unraveling. Religion just comes straight back. The Orthodox Church has never been stronger in Russia, and now all the money that was put into putting down temples and so on in China is being ploughed back into putting them back up again at a massive scale. I mean, hundreds of thousands of buildings a year going up. So it just doesn't seem to me to stand up at all.
I mean, there are countries, aren't there? Like if you look at Britain, if you look at Western Europe, if you look at Sweden, in Scandinavian countries, they're all countries where religious belief has declined, attendance.
I think that northwestern Europe is the exception,
okay.
But it's very much the exception. And
isn't the Czech Republic the least religious country in Europe?
I thought it was
Maybe.
Finland. I think it's
Well, anyway, that's not important.
But there's a difference. No, is it important? Because there's a difference between what you might call sort of inorganic secularization and organic secularization. So it's not so surprised that cultures that have been subjected to inorganic secularization, where secularization has been forced on them, like, for example, in the case of Russia, might bounce back, or Romania might bounce back. But it doesn't seem that Sweden's going to bounce back from its more organic secularization that has occurred, as part of the fabric of society.
Yeah, I think that's a useful distinction. But, Mike, would you like to pick up?
Well, I don't want to lose out in the victimhood stakes here. I'd like to make clear, not only am I an atheist, I'm a lapsed Irish Catholic, I've suffered too, Speaking as an atheist, what I really object to is the whole outlook that's been put forward by the new atheists. It seems to me what's happening here is you've got this phenomenon of essentially exhausted and disillusioned liberals at a particular stage coming out of the building and seeing a man with carrying the "Repent is the end is nigh" banner and giving him a good kicking. That's kind of what's going on here. And this really struck me about reading Christopher Hitchens' polemic against Mother Teresa. You think one of the most talented polemicists of the left of the late 20th century has got to devote his entire energies on dealing with a completely ludicrous old fraud that everybody knew about in the beginning. And you see this whole discourse that's emerged from the so-called Four Horsemen. It's characterised by a quite intemperate, contemptuous, dismissive sort of tone. I think what that really reflects is an underlying sense of bad faith, on the one hand, about their own, a sort of insecurity about their own position, but also a kind of sort of envy. We've lost all our faith, they still got theirs. And we're really bitterly resentful about that. And it gives the whole discussion a very dogmatic and intolerant sort of character, really reflecting a lack of confidence about their own convictions, which I think is also apparent even in the way they approach scientific debate. They always want to present the science as closed, the science, fetishized in capital letters, but as something which is closed. It's a retreat to 19th century positivism. The science is finished, it's just a matter of applying science to society. And there are many examples of this in various discussions in the conference today, of the extension of the notions of natural sciences to society in a way which can't be justified on the basis of the science itself. And I think that's the whole outlook, which gives atheism a bad name. It exacerbates the underlying problem of the dismissal of subjectivity, which is the source of the whole problem in the first place, and is what I think we need to put atheism on the back burner and concentrate on rescuing humanism, and particularly on rescuing the human subject.
I'm sure most people here, whether they're atheists or not, they still celebrate Christmas and stuff like that, and in many other places, a lot of the religious holidays and everything. And do you have to be atheist in order to challenge religion? You can be agnostic. How can you prove that there's no God? It's the same thing that you can't really prove that there's a God. It's a belief.
I just wanted to come back on Michael Fitzpatrick's point there at the end about the new atheists. They've lost their faith. We've lost our faith. Why haven't they lost theirs? But surely it ties in more with what a few of the other speakers said, which is that they perhaps did listen to what Marx said, what maybe Nietzsche said, and thought that the process of the 20th century and where politics was going to go was going to see the end of these beliefs that they think are ludicrous anyway. And now they're genuinely frustrated. It's not envy. But it hasn't happened, and so they need to attack.
I don't think for Marx it was the increased well-being that would lead to the withering away of religion. It was supposed to be humanity's mastery over nature. And part of the whole idea of God was that it was the absence of a consciousness of man being self-made, of the development of man and the accretion over generations of what man's action on the world had actually achieved. And it was the projecting of that collective power of human development onto an external being that was the source of the idea of God. Now, today, I would suggest that, it is possible to have religious humanists and it's possible to have atheist humanists, and they both exist. And it's better to have a religious humanist than it is to have an atheist anti-humanist, because they both exist. However, it is humanism that's the key, and recognizing that it is man's activity in the world that counts, and making the best of that, I think is the way we should kind of unpack this discussion and see our relation and attitude towards atheism or God.
I just have a question for Mark Vernon. You said that the Orthodox Church is stronger than ever in Russia. Well, I think that's a point to the atheists, because as we could see this, not long ago, the Pussy Riot, big thing. Are they bigger than ever because the church is such an oppressive power that if they don't agree, if they're not on the side of the church, then they're arrested?
My name is Rania and I'm a Muslim. Oh God, I shouldn't be here, should I? Actually, I find the discussion fascinating. I could listen to you for another 6 hours probably, but I want to come back to Mark's point. And actually, something to Andrew, I did call myself once a Muslim humanist, and an atheist friend said, I'm not allowed to do that. So maybe you can respond to that. But actually, Mark, I like the way you described the atheist as a challenge to theists. And is it possibly that, again, linking to Mike, that in this climate where the human subject has been diminished to a series of, biological cells that is incapable of having an impact on his life, that religion is actually putting forward the human subject? Not obviously, it can be oppressive, like states can be oppressive, like different groups can be oppressive, but we are seeing a resurgence of a kind of tradition and humanity through religion in response to all the challenges it has faced in the 20th century.
I would like to make a comment regarding atheism. I think people believe it's not a religion. I think it is a religion, and it's a fault to say that atheists do not believe in God. Actually, they believe there is no God. There's a very big difference between the two, and they have organized to advocate that belief. So it is a religion. And I think, in the light of that comment, I think maybe the title of this session should be not atheism, what's the point? Religion, what's the point?
Thank you for picking me up on my marks. I knew it was a dangerous person to raise in an audience like this. But I think it's not completely different, actually, because although I talked about material well-being, I think the idea that our natural home was in a materialistic universe kind of chimes with perhaps what you were saying. And so we would feel less alienated when we owned up, as it were, to our materialistic nature. So it's not so dissimilar, perhaps. The point about the Orthodox Church as well, I think that's absolutely right. These are always ambivalent things, and orthodoxy is partly on the resurgence so much in Russia because it's so closely tied to Russian nationalism as well. So it's a political issue as well as a religious issue, but it's full of ambivalence and difficulty therefore. I actually think humanism is, in its origins, a religious idea. And I don't think there would be atheistic humanism if there hadn't been religious humanism, first of all. The only difference is that atheistic humanism forgets the God reference. But in Christianity, it's known as the doctrine of the image, made in the image of God. The thing which makes you want to feel that humanity is, as it were, the crux of life and not, say, something else. I think is broadly a religious idea, and the Islamic tradition would have a similar kind of tradition as the Imago Dei in Christianity and Judaism and so on. So yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, I would tend, when using the word humanism, to use it in what is its sort of contemporary and mainstream usage, which very clearly denotes a non-religious, non-theistic
Not if you're in the
view
Vatican,
of the view of the world. Well, I'm not in the Vatican, am I? That's why I said I would use it as this. And I don't think it's useful, actually, to use it in other ways. I'm talking about the English word humanism, which, of course, is sometimes used to translate Italian and German words, which is not directly etymologically related, and historically always, every time it's used. But I don't really care what people call themselves. It doesn't really interest me. So if you want to call yourself a religious humanist, by all means do. But I don't think it's a very useful use of the word. But I'll talk quickly about humanism, given that it's been raised. I do agree with what was implied in one or two of the questions. Is that the important thing in any view of the world and of people is the humanist element, and that's sort of what I'm saying. So I think that although atheism is useful in order to be a focus point for a rejection of religious beliefs that inhibit and fetter people and make them feel trapped, I think obviously that the humanism, an approach to life that focuses on the needs of humanity in the here and now, that doesn't look to justice in a world to come, but seeks to build a better world here, that focuses on human beings as being capable of goodness to each other and capable of making a better society for themselves, is the most important perspective. Now, I think that for most people in Britain who have an atheist view, humanism will follow from that atheist view. So I think to that extent as well, there's a point in atheism. I feel like I'm trying to follow too strictly the actual title of this session rather than just saying what I think. And so I will just quickly forget about the nuances and the title and say that I completely disagree with what's been said about the nature and substance of the so-called new atheists, whom it's very convenient to lump together and to deride in this way as if what they say is purely negative, without remembering that they are not starting this whole thing off. They are very clearly reacting to an awful lot of problems that both organised religion and religious beliefs on the individual level have caused. And I don't think polemic is a legitimate way of expressing a view in order to give that view attention. And I think that actually, by and large, the arguments that they've made and the volumes that they've written have been temperate and well measured. They're certainly not, violent and intolerant. I don't think that's true at all.
People say, why do you call yourself an atheist and not an agnostic? I find agnostic an entirely useless term. It doesn't convey anything, really, because agnosticism implies that there might be a God or something. This is the problem. When people are religious, if they identify with Islam or Hinduism or Christianity or whatever, what they're saying is that they have access to what this thing called God thinks. Okay? They're saying there's this being, this thing, and through our priests, through our holy books, we know what that being wants us to do in the world. That is what religion requires you to believe. And agnosticism is entirely pointless. It's just like, maybe there's this thing, but so what? Okay, it doesn't matter if you're one of these people who think, I feel there's something bigger out there, but you have no access to what that thing knows or wants or feels, and therefore that thing has no influence in your life. Whereas if you believe in God, if you follow a religion, then what you are making is a claim about what that God wants you to do. Belief is important because what we believe affects what we do in this world. And so we have to be clear about what we believe and honest about it. And so that's my point about agnosticism. I think it's a mostly useless position unless you're going to get into kind of philosophical word games. I don't collect stamps. Is anybody out there going to call me a stamp collector? No, and yet I don't believe in God, and yet somebody out there would claim that I have a religion as an atheist. It's a silly semantic game which is not worth playing. Again, atheists have certain beliefs about the world, but they don't believe in a supernatural entity that in any way influences the world, and therefore they do not follow a religion. I really find that argument very frustrating. Can you tell? Anyway, religion and culture. Yeah, Christmas is great. I'm going to celebrate Christmas. I'm going to have a fantastic Christmas with my family. But there is no reason why everybody in the world shouldn't celebrate Christmas. And in fact, it's my great hope. I do believe that Christmas will, at some point in the near future, become a global celebration. All my Muslim friends celebrate Christmas. They put up trees and they have presents, and they've embraced it as a time to spend with family and so forth. And I think there is an insidiousness in suggesting that people who come from particularly religious communities or whatever, lose something when they give up God. I think they gain much more. And I'm inclined to encourage them to give up their religious beliefs and carry on celebrating Eid and Christmas. You don't need to believe in God to have a party, quite frankly.
Yeah, I hate Christmas. But just to come to that, I mean, my objection to the new atheists is not their polemical character. I'm always up for a polemic. What I object to is the target of their polemic is completely misplaced, and the terms in which it's conducted. It attacks religion in a way that's theologically illiterate, and it's extraordinarily intolerant. I mean, and has a very dogmatic character. I mean, that's the common theme of those books, which I've laboured through. And I think one of the interesting features of this debate, actually, if you read their books, how tedious they are. If you want some interesting insights into this debate, read something by a Christian theologian, or any sort of theologian. You find much more laughs, for a start, and much more illumination. One of the themes of the new atheist that has been brought out here is the consistent exaggeration of the influence of religion in the political sphere. It's a very predominant thing in the States, where every problem of American society from a liberal perspective is blamed on the religious right, which is actually marginal force in American society. You wouldn't think that from reading any of that. You think the whole of American society was menaced by rabid creationists. Similarly, Dawkins has to dig out one school where there's a creationist, somebody wants to put creationism on the curriculum to justify making it a major theme of his book. These are marginal phenomena in Western society. And the so-called various variation forms of religious fundamentalism, Christian and Islamic, also tend to be greatly exaggerated, and by being lumped together, their specific political features, which are, in my view, far more important than any religious character that they might have, are lost, and therefore any real understanding of them is occluded. And I think that's the reason why I object to that whole approach. The thing about humanism is that we need to cling to is the idea of humanism as an open-ended orientation to experience, an openness to all forms of it, and that includes religious experience. And somebody talked about the world of the world of culture that is involved with religion. There's a tremendous depth and wealth of human culture on a global scale that relates to the whole world of religion. And everybody that wants to understand the movement of human society needs to appreciate that tradition and appropriate it, certainly if you're thinking in terms of changing the world, which I think is the traditional humanist perspective we badly need to get back to.
Philip Rafe's famous book, published in 1966, is subtitled The Uses of Faith After Freud. And the title of the book, of course, is The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And when Alom did his Atheist Anonymous introduction, it made me think that, and it's the strident posters, there is a therapeutic aspect to this, and certainly a therapeutic aspect to the rise of religion. It's not religion in the way it was, because prayer as therapy is a very common phenomenon. And I'm just sort of hoping that Alan's not going to start atheist prayers as well, prayer as therapy for atheists. And it just seems there's a therapeutic aspect to it that explains both the interest in religion and also, I think, some of the strident denunciations of it. Like, we want the therapy as well.
Very quickly, I just want to say to Mark, your ideas about the resurgence of religion, I think, are entirely erroneous. The idea that Scandinavia is this exception. Have you heard of Japan? Japan, God belief is below 70%. Australia, it's an all-time low. New Zealand as well. Many other countries we could mention, the United States, not least. Turns out that Marx was right. Even the United States, where you look, it's wherever the economics are worst in a state that God belief is highest. And that's a picture around the world as well, in Europe as well, where people are struggling. Religion has a firm foothold. I just want to say very quickly to Michael,
I think you're wrong about creationists. It's about 40%. The United States certainly not invented over 50 judicial proceedings in the last 30 years to try and get creationism taught in schools. I think you're wrong that this is an invented scenario. And just finally, very quickly, the idea that there was a vociferous voice, a kind of shrill new atheism, it is, I think, as Andrew very eloquently said, this is a reaction to the repression of centuries. Gay people have had to put up with the recriminations of religious people, all the crap that they've taught for centuries. And so those buses travelling around, that's our gay Mardi Gras. It's quite modest, really.
I just have a quick comment and a question to Alam about what you said about being either an atheist or a religious person and having to choose. I think it's helpful to draw a parallel with the homosexuality debate. I think it's a crude oversimplification to say that it's black and white and people have to choose one or the other. You know, people can choose to identify as gay or bisexual or straight. Actually, to follow your example, I don't collect stamps either, but I recently got a letter from Korea and I kept the envelope because I really like the stamp. And my and my question is about what we can learn from religion. In his book, I think it's called Religion for Atheists. Religion for Atheists, that's right. Alain de Botton argues that there is a lot we can learn from religion, and the gentleman down here touched on that, mentioning therapy. And so I was just wondering if the panel thought that there were teachings and ideas and concepts that could be valuable, that we could learn from.
Okay, thank you. Mainly a question for Andrew, actually, which is I'm a supposedly humanist, I suppose. I'm definitely atheist. I don't believe in God. I'm a science communicator. I make my money going around to schools doing rocket workshops for kids. So I definitely do the sort of the science, pro-science communication. As far as I'm aware, I have not really had any kind of interaction with the British Humanist Association through my life, and I have lived a reasonably successful sort of non-goddy existence. So, to sort of paraphrase the title of the talk, the British Humanist Association, what's the point?
Oh, there should be an event about that, definitely.
One thing that worries me about atheism today is the way it's become a sort of identity, and the fact that you are an atheist is seen to imply that you take a certain view on the world, and that somehow either implies or entails that you take on certain values or principles. So whilst I think it is nice to believe that the rejection of God might lead to some sort of humanism, I'm not sure that is necessarily the case. So I'm interested in what the panel think. I mean, do you think there is a line from the rejection of a belief in God to having a certain view? One thing that frustrates me, I think, about the new atheists is the way that they kind of try and speak for me as an atheist. They're saying this is the sort of thing that you should think as an atheist, but I disagree with them. So I think there is an historical point that maybe in the West, the articulation of some sort of atheism was quite a forward-looking moment, and it led to the articulation of an intellectual space for the playing out of lots of different views. I think today it's more the case that there isn't really that intellectual vigour within people who have rejected God in one way or another. So is there something to be said of the lack of dynamism in people who would define themselves as atheists? And what actually is important is not that you don't believe in God, but actually where you take yourself after the rejection of that belief in God.
Yeah, I'm just to respond to the questions. That's right. I'm glad you can still make rockets. That's a very nice thought in classrooms these days. On the statistical point, secularization, the thesis of secularization that religion's in decline is massively being revised. There's now a whole academic industry looking at this. But for the headline, my source would be the book that John Micklethwaite, the editor of The Economist, wrote a couple of years ago, called God is Back, which could have the subtitle God Never Really Went Away. And if you've ever written for The Economist, you'll know that statistics matter to them. And so I just take it from that. I just wanted to make a point about gay marriage as well, because I think that actually the truth is that the way that society provides institutions for same-sex relationships to be validated and carry social weight and so on just varies across time. It was big in ancient Greece, for example. A very fascinating book about the medieval period written by a chap called Alan Bray, a Catholic historian, called The Friend, looks at how there was a whole institution for same-sex couples to validate their relationships that carried social weight, that made a difference in society, not just a kind of private, as it were, sentimental exchange. This got forgotten in the early modern period because social relationships had to be validated by the law rather than by making a promise to someone else under God. So I just think it's wrong that gay marriage can only really sort of emerge in a post-religious world. That just doesn't seem to me to be right.
Firstly, I'm not asking anybody to choose what they believe. I believe you should have the right to choose. And I think lots of people don't have the right to choose. I really want to emphasize this. There are people who live in the UK and obviously elsewhere in the world who don't have the right to choose about these things. And I think that's an unacceptable state of affairs. It's absolutely fundamentally unacceptable, and we should change that. Coming back to your point about identity, I'm an atheist, I'm a humanist, I'm a Bangladeshi, I'm a teacher. I could give you a whole string of identity labels that I wear, and some of those identities will come to the fore depending on which situation I find myself in. However, how I choose to define myself as an atheist might not be the same as how somebody else chooses to define me as an atheist, and that's the problem with all identity labels. Identity labels do not have agreed upon specific meanings, although there are all sorts of pressures from those around us who wear the same label to make us conform to their ideas of identity. And I think it's important to know which identities we as individuals think we hold, because some of those identities influence the wider world and how we engage with the wider world, particularly in matters of politics and so forth. So I think atheist is an incredibly important identity label for people to hold, but as you said, it's not necessarily an identity label that everybody agrees upon the definition of. Does that make sense? And I think that's the same of all identity labels.
Ray Tallis spoke at the opening session of this conference. I think it's appropriate to conclude the final session by quoting him in his recent defense of his atheism. Ray says, "God is the greatest idea humans have ever had. Humanism is about the possibility of moving beyond it."
Okay. I'll take the sort of "I'm all right, what's the point of the British Humanist Association" question as a way of getting in a free plug very quickly for the British Humanist Association. We're great for you, obviously, that you're okay. There's three main areas of work that the British Humanist Association does. Obviously, most people, and certainly I'm one of them, who have non-religious beliefs and either implicit or explicitly humanist view of the world, are quite happy going about their lives. But there are people, as Alom in particular has indicated, who do need to know that the views that they have, maybe sort of incoherently, maybe not quite together in their minds, that sort of bundle of views that can be labelled as humanism in its secular sense, is a respectable view of the world, a coherent view of the world. It's not second best. It's been held by some of the greatest social activists and thinkers and just regular men and women all over the world in many different times, and there's no need for people to feel anything other than confidence in being able to live a fulfilling and meaningful and ethical life on the basis of those beliefs. And there are people who need that support, and that's why it's important to have an organisation that is one of its main tasks, promotes that view and tries to raise public awareness of it. Secondly, the British Humanist Association obviously trains people to do things like non-religious funerals, which are incredibly popular, and other sorts of ceremonies. And they're obviously for non-religious people who, without having access to a religious tradition, may lack in some senses the resources for celebrating and dealing with those important periods in life. And about 500,000 people a year in the UK attend one of those ceremonies, so they're meeting a very real need in the community. And of course then there's the work of the British Humanist Association in terms of campaigning for secularism in our public life and in our institutions, and in law and policy, removing discrimination against people on the basis of religion and belief, removing religious privilege. And with that in mind, I want to just quickly defend the whole idea of organising in a non-religious way and defend a point of atheism, which is to say that I do not believe that religious privilege and discrimination based on religion is marginal in our society at all. In the last few years, we've seen the largest ever increase of state-funded religious schools in the UK, which is now going on, probably another 300 by the end of next year. State-funded schools which discriminate in their admissions policies, which have a biased curriculum, have discriminatory employment policies. And yes, there are also lots of other awful things happening, and there are lots of other reasons why people do bad things apart from religion. But that doesn't mean that that's not an important issue that needs campaigning against on its own grounds. And atheism is a very important reaction in that sense that needs more social force behind it.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We can now continue in the bar.